Meeting number 20 of the Special Committee on Canada-China Relations, pursuant to order of reference of Wednesday, September 23, 2020, the committee is meeting on its study of Canada-China relations. Il s'agit d'une réunion hybride, conformément à la motion adoptée.
This is a hybrid meeting pursuant to the motion passed by the House on January 25th, 2021.
Our first panel from the Public Health Agency of Canada, we have Mr. Ian Stewart, President, as well as Dr. Guillaume Paliquin, Acting Vice President, National Microbiology Laboratory. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Merci beaucoup. I will now turn the floor over to Mr. Stewart for the opening remarks. Please proceed. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you, Mr. Chair. So thanks for the invitation to discuss the Public Health Agency of Canada's relationship with China. A key focus of the Public Health Agency's relationship is, of course, in the context of the response to COVID-19. In the case of COVID-19, the Public Health Agency became aware on December 30th at 10:30 p.m. That something was happening in Wuhan via GFIN, the Global Public Health Intelligence Network that we run. For us, it was a big thing, and this detection of an outbreak of pneumonia in Wuhan was distributed in our daily report the next morning, December 31st. And supplementary monitoring started right away.
Pardon me, I'm sorry, Mr. Stewart. I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but are you able to turn your camera on, or is there a problem? We can't see you. I don't know if you know that.
No, I didn't know that.
Thank you. Please proceed.
Okay, well, thanks, and thanks for the tip. Sorry about that, members. So, Mr. Chair, as I was saying, we detected something in Wuhan on December 30th in the evening, late evening. And the next day, we sent out through the daily notification that in fact an infection event was occurring in Wuhan. And the next day, Dr. Tam notified the Council of Chief Medical Officers of Health, and we alerted Federal Provincial Public Health Network Communications Group and the Canadian Public Health Laboratory Network. So for us, it started abruptly in the end of December, very beginning of January, with the world in the midst of an unprecedented global health event that this resulted in. Learning more about zoonotic sources of virus has become crucial to better understand the situation and to help prevent future pandemics. That's why in May 2020, Canada co-sponsored the World Health Assembly Resolution 73.1, which called for an impartial, independent, and comprehensive review of the WHO coordinated international health response to COVID-19 and scientific and collaborative field research missions, which laid the groundwork for the joint WHO-China mission on the origins of SARS-CoV-2 virus. In January 2021, a team of WHO-convened international experts traveled to China to work with Chinese counterparts to advance these efforts. Their reports are expected in the coming weeks. Canada is committed to supporting the WHO in its scientific work, and Canadian officials have reiterated the need for China to be open and transparent as part of this process. Canada and China share a long-standing relationship in health dating back to an MOU signed in 1995, calling for regular dialogue on health-related issues. And the Canada-China policy dialogue on health has been the main vehicle for our formal bilateral engagement, including at the ministerial level for 4 dialogues between 2009 and 2014. Since 2014, engagement with China has primarily been in health-related multilateral fora, such as the WHO and the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Health Working Group. China has a growing capacity for basic and applied research, and there's a mutual benefit from academic exchanges. Reflecting on this, in January 2007, Canada and China signed a science and technology cooperation agreement. The agreement launched a sustained effort to boost collaborative research and development in fields like life sciences to promote collaboration in research and development between Chinese and Canadian academics and both private and public sector researchers and innovators. The initial areas of focus in life sciences included vaccines. As with all collaborations, care is required to make sure that both parties have a clear understanding of the uses of the information being exchanged and, of course, the intellectual property that underlies the research teams. In our work, we've taken important steps to protect against security threats and intellectual property concerns. The Ministers of Health, Industry, Science and Innovation, and Public Health jointly issued a policy statement on research security and COVID-19 in September 2020, encouraging members of the research community to take precautions to protect the security of COVID-19 related research, intellectual property, and knowledge development. So challenges persist in any relationship, but there are benefits in exchanging in information and research, and there's meaningful opportunities to do so through the relationships that I just described. The global pandemic underscores the importance of international engagement and coordination, and international coordination will remain important to managing the pandemic going forward. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to make remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stewart. We will now go to the first round of questions. We'll start with Mr. Chong. You have 6 minutes. Mr. Chong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Stewart, for appearing in front of us. In July of 2019, one of the researchers at the lab in Winnipeg and her husband had their security clearances revoked and were escorted out of the lab. Can you tell us why?
That matter was a subject of investigation. That was a security investigation, and I'm not going to be able to talk about the details of that investigation.
Did you cooperate with the RCMP investigation?
Do I cooperate with the RCMP investigation?
No. Did you and the employees of the lab cooperate with the RCMP investigation?
There is an RCMP investigation underway at this time, and if RCMP need anything from us, they will have our cooperation for sure.
Because there was a CBC report that indicated that staff members at the lab who spoke on background to CBC had indicated that senior management had not made them accessible to police or allowed staff to contact the RCMP with relevant information. Are you aware of that CBC report?
I'm not aware of that CBC report. However, I would say if the RCMP want anything from us, we will of course support them in that investigation.
So are you indicating to employees that they're free to contact the RCMP with any relevant information that they might have?
I'm surprised that this is an issue. The RCMP have been doing an extensive investigation, and we will of course support them in any way required.
Okay, so I'll take that as a yes, that employees of the lab are free to contact the RCMP with any relevant information that they might have, because the RCMP has indicated that they're interested in any information that people might have. I note that these scientists were just released were just terminated from their employment at the lab 5 weeks ago. Can you tell us what happened exactly with the shipment of the shipment that took place from the lab in March of 2019 to China? This is not a personnel matter. This concerns a shipment of live Ebola and Hendra viruses to Beijing on an Air Canada flight on March 31st of 2019 that raised concerns.
Can I tell you in what sense, Mr. Chair?
Well, there was a in what sense? In what sense is this? There was a CBC news report dated August of 2019 that said that the shipment of these live viruses to China raises questions, and that the shipment may not have been done according to the lab's operating procedures. Is that news story correct?
Well, all that we do in conformity with the Human Pathogens and Toxins Act and the Transportation of Dangerous Goods Act and the Canadian Biosafety Standards. So I don't think I'm able to comment on that specific allegation. I just know from a policy level at this time, those are the policies that we're guided by, sir.
Okay, and so that shipment that took place on March 31st then was done in accordance with the requirements under the Human Pathogens and Toxins Act. It was done in accordance with the Transportation of Dangerous Goods Act and the Canadian Biosafety Standard and the lab's own standard operating procedures. Is that correct? So that, in other words, what you're telling this committee is that there was nothing concerning about the shipment of those viruses, those live viruses, to China in March of 2019, that everything was done properly, according to law, according to regulation, and according to standard operating procedure. Is that correct?
Okay. What I said was those are what we're guided by. And I think if you'll allow me, I'll turn to my colleague who runs the lab
Sure.
and who was around at the time that you're referring to, because I started this job after the date being discussed. So, Dr.
Please go ahead.
Palican.
Time's of limit here, so.
Yeah, so the specific shipment that was being referenced, Mr. Chair, was done in accordance with the lab's standard operating procedures in compliance with the HPTA and the Transport of Dangerous Goods Act, as well as the Canadian Biosafety Standards.
Okay, thank you. Can you understand why Canadians are concerned about the termination of the employment of these two scientists at the lab, and why it's concerning that no further information is being released, even to a parliamentary committee? Because it creates a lot of suspicions and questions, the release of the termination of these two scientists. So I'm asking if you would be forthcoming to let us know why they were terminated. You're protected here in front of a parliamentary committee. You have privilege as a witness. In other words, your testimony here cannot be used against you outside of this committee. So the Canadian public would like to know why these two scientists were terminated.
Mr. Chong, regrettably, the time, of course, as you said, is limited, and the time is not protected in that sense. And I'm afraid yours has concluded. So it may be that someone else can raise the same question again, and then we'll have a chance for the witnesses, one of the witnesses, perhaps, or both, to answer that question. But now I have to go on. Maintenant, je tourne à Monsieur Dubourg.
Mr. Dubourg, you have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. I will be sharing my time with my colleague, Mr. Fracas Katos. But first of all, let me greet the witnesses who are here with us today. Dr. Pelican and also Mr. Stewart. I'm very happy to hear you speak this afternoon. Mr. Stewart, you said in your introduction that you had discussions with China about science, technology, and intellectual property. Can you expand on those discussions that you had with China, please?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I was referring, sir, to a series of agreements that the Government of Canada and China have reached around collaboration in research, as you note. And those go back for many years. In the case of science and technology in particular, they go back to a 2007 arrangement focused on life sciences and, as I mentioned, areas such as vaccines.
Okay, mais pendant
But during that period, since March, I'd say, how do you qualify the discussions, if you do have any discussions with the Chinese authorities or your counterparts in China, whether or not it's dealing with vaccines or with the processes to help citizens?
Well, these are normally done as missions of scientists and government officials, and usually there are events we go over, and there's specific topics of concerns, areas of research where presentations are made. So it's of that nature.
Okay, d'accord.
All right. I'd like to know this. During this period of the pandemic, have you put in place any type of additional security measures surrounding the research that is being done by agents in Canada?
Now, do you mean at the Public Health Agency?
Oui,
Yes,
si ça
at the Public Health
des cyber
Agency, and anything that might also deal with cyber attacks, anything to avoid compromising our research.
This has been an area of concern for the government, and I believe CSIS and perhaps CSEC, who would be known to this committee, put out guidance and, in fact, warnings about persistent threat actors and activity around research related to the COVID situation. And so, you know, yes, it's not for me to speak about their activities with respect to cybersecurity and so on. But yes, you're absolutely right, sir. That has been an area of concern.
D'accord, merci. Mais
Yes, thank you. But, well, you said that CSIS, I understand that. It's their mandate. But did you contact them, or did they contact you to be careful about any type of process that is occurring in your agency?
The people who are responsible for digital security, cybersecurity, have been doing a fair amount of outreach, as you're suggesting, to government labs like ourselves, as well as to the private sector and others. And again, I'm not necessarily best positioned to speak about what they're doing. With respect to ourselves, we take cybersecurity very seriously, particularly around our labs and particularly around the research that we're doing related to COVID. It has been an area where, in fact, we have been paying particular attention, sir.
merci.
Thank you. One last question, Mr. Stewart. We had the opportunity to meet Dr. Scott Halperin, who is director of the Canadian Vaccination Centre at Dalhousie University. We know that he's been over there sometimes on several occasions, and have you been in contact with Mr. Halperin with respect to vaccinations, for example?
Yes, well, actually, in my career, I had an opportunity to work at Dalhousie University, and I know Dr. Halperin from back to that period some time ago. And more recently, at my time at the National Research Council, we had discussions related to his work at the Canadian Vaccination Centre. He is, in fact, a pivotal part of the Canadian research community in that way. And so, yes, I do know, and I have spoken with Dr. Halperin.
OK. Et cette discussion-là, est-ce que vous en avez eu?
And that discussion, did you have it when he came back from China? Or did you discuss about his research or discoveries, for example?
I've actually never spoken to Dr. Halperin about his trips to China, nor about his actual personal research in the context that I'm discussing now. I've been talking to him in the context of his leadership for the Canadian Vaccination Centre at Dalhousie. And so that was around projects he does for that institution. Sorry, Mr. Chair.
No, OK. Thank you so much, Mr. Stewart.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. Et maintenant, pendant 6 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Bergeron, you have 6 minutes. Microphone, please. Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank our witnesses as well today. Mr. Poliquin was a little bit surprised by the brevity of what you said as introductory remarks. But in any case, I would just like to follow along Mr. Chong's line of questioning with respect to the couple of Chinese researchers that went to China on several occasions. Once in July 2019, where I don't know if it was in July 2019. Oh, yes. In any case, after having been in China, where there was where they sent live virus of Ebola and Nipah, why were they let go? Why did you wait several months before you really let them go definitively?
they're no longer with the agency, and we undertook investigation, and I'm not really at liberty to talk more about that, sir.
Qu'est-ce que vous entendez par vous n'avez...
What do you mean by you're not at liberty to talk about that? You're in a parliamentary committee here. You are covered by parliamentary privilege, if you like. My question is simple. Why were they, first of all, there when they came back, but they didn't get fired until several months later? Why was that?
An investigation was undertaken, and they no longer work with the agency.
Donc, il y a lieu de penser...
So that might lead us to think that everything wasn't done according to the rules, because after an investigation, they were there, but they were later let go. So how can you explain that? Yes, we've understood that, but what did they do wrong? What were they facing? Why are they no longer with the agency?
To discuss the details of that investigation, sir.
Je regrette, monsieur, mais...
I'm very sorry, sir, but you're putting me in a position where you could be accused of contempt of Parliament. You're refusing to answer a simple question. You said earlier that everything was done according to the rules, but after investigation, they were set aside, and then ultimately they were let go. So why were they set aside and then ultimately let go if they did everything according to the rules? Your answer gives rise to many questions, not just to parliamentarians like us and like myself, but also to the general public, because possibly information might have been transmitted to the Chinese authorities.
I'm sorry, sir. What's the question that you'd like me to answer? Please excuse me.
La question est...
My question is simple. Why were they set aside, investigated?
They were investigated, and the investigation was completed, and they no longer are part of the agency.
Ça, on le comprend.
We certainly understand that, but we don't understand why, if everything was done according to the rules, that they were set aside, that they were no longer allowed to go on. What did they do wrong?
Sir, you've asked me the question. I can repeat the answer. An investigation was undertaken. They're no longer part of the agency.
Non, non,
and
écoutez, ça, on le comprend, là.
I'm not
clair.
at liberty. I'm
Mais
not
ce
at
qu'on ne
liberty
comprend pas,
to discuss it
ce qu'on ne
further.
comprend pas,
Yes, we understand that, but what we don't understand is why they were set aside. Why were they let go? We understand there was an investigation, but why then, if everything was done according to the rules, was there this investigation? It leads you to think that everything wasn't done according to the rules. So there must have been some fault, and there had to have been enough safeguards in place against any transmission of information to the Chinese authorities. Maybe that wasn't the case. So what was the fault that they committed? What did they do wrong?
I'm not at liberty to discuss the details of that investigation, sir.
rappel au règlement, monsieur.
On a point of order, Mr. Chair, is the witness not obliged to answer the questions put to him by the parliamentarians? Well, thank you, Mr. Bergeron. I have the impression that the witnesses can answer in the way that they choose, in the manner that they wish, and the committee can certainly discuss that. I'm going to announce to the witnesses that we will certainly take into consideration and under advisement their refusal to answer what is particularly bad in terms of transparency and accountability for Canadians and for Quebecers, because clearly there was a breach, a security breach. And we know that live viruses were transported on Air Canada. Is that the usual practice? And we also know that there was a breach with respect to the vaccines. I'm sorry, Mr. Bergeron. I have to now turn to Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Chair. And Mr. Stewart, the individuals that we're talking about here, I know you haven't answered Mr. Bergeron's question, but I'll ask one more. Were these individuals charged with any offense?
They would not be charged with an offense by us, sir. That would be something that would come from, of course, police officers or an investigative body of some kind.
But you would know
in that regard.
But you would know that.
At this time, I'm not aware of them being charged of any offense. What I can say is that an investigation was done, and they're no longer with the Public Health Agency.
So you've never done any follow-up to find out what happened to them, whether they were charged, whether they weren't, what the results of the investigation were?
Well, to my knowledge, they have not been charged, but that's a matter you would want to pose to the RCMP. It's not an area that we're.
But you said there was an investigation that went on, but you have no idea of the results of the investigation and what was you weren't involved in that.
The RCMP investigation is not a matter that we're directly involved in. We're happy to support them in any way.
They wouldn't report back to you as to that these people just were investigated and that was it, and they're no longer there. How did they leave?
Oh, they've left the agency.
On their own?
The two scientists are no longer employed by the Public Health Agency.
Yeah, that we understand that, but people leave in various ways. Sometimes people retire, some resign, some get another job. They were under investigation and they left, and you're saying you have no idea why they left or how they left or what the results of the investigation were.
No, actually, I did not say we have no idea about why they left. I said they no longer work at the Public Health Agency, and we can't disclose additional information on this matter.
Let's see what you can disclose about something else. You talked about GPHIN, the GFIN, yes, the very well-regarded agency that operated inside of public health for a very long time and was recognized worldwide as having a global alert system that was well respected and needed, and in fact looked to around the world for alerts on things like the COVID-19 situation happening. You said that you got information from them on the December 31st that there was something going on in Wuhan, correct?
10:30 p.m. on December 30th, sir. GFIN gave us an indication that there was something of interest in Wuhan.
So now, then you followed up on that, I presume. You were glad that they were able to give you that information and presumably got further reports from them. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
But now we have a very thorough investigative report published by the Globe and Mail in July of last year, outlining a whole series of problems after that amongst the people who were involved in that alert system, providing information that was not getting to the right place. Can you tell us about that?
I can, sir. Thank you for the question. First of all, GFIN is a platform. It's a technology for gathering open source information. And secondly, it's an expert group who interpret and provide broadcast notifications out. They do a daily report and they do an alert report. And though daily report was what came out the next day, indicating that there had been an indication of interest in Wuhan.
But now, as things, these daily reports that were being filed internally, that it's reported that they began to face pushback from within the department, and they were told to focus their efforts on official statements such as data from the Chinese government and the WHO. And other sources of information were just rumors, they were told, and they just wanted the report restricted to only official information. Can you confirm that?
I haven't seen any guidance that they should focus their attention on information sourced from the government of China.
So there's no official written guidance, but when someone says that they were told that, then you're saying that there was no official guidance. But they were also criticized at one point, a few weeks after the outbreak. The public health director was asked why GIFIN's internal reports had missed crucial developments now being widely reported in the news around the world, that human-to-human transmission had been detected. And the response was from the analysts that the information had in fact been discussed in earlier reports and before the documents went up the chain, and somehow the information was taken out of that. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I think in my introductory remarks, I mentioned that a special report was issued at 9 a.m. on January 1st. And the special report included that there was this event of interest occurring in Wuhan. And Dr. Tam used that the following day to talk to the Council of Chief Medical Officers of Health.
Yes, I understand that there was some issues, and but at the same time, the information that they were aware of regarding human-to-human transmission never made it up the chain. In fact, that this was something that was not known by these most senior people.
Mr. Harris, thank you very much. Sorry for interrupting, but your 6 minutes has concluded. We'll now go to the second round and begin with Mr. Jennis for 5 minutes. Mr. Jennis, please.
Mr. Stewart, has there ever been a case where any government lab has fired scientists as a result of security breaches or the improper transfer of viruses?
That's a very difficult question to answer.
I'm glad you have a bloody senior office in this country where you're supposed to account to parliamentarians and the Canadian people. Now answer the damn question.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. I just want to ask members to conduct themselves, of course, in a parliamentary fashion.
I would like to ask the witness.
I do appreciate the member is entitled to ask the question. I just ask him to be parliamentary and try to remain calm. I understand.
Mr. Stewart, this is a critical issue of national security. Has any lab in this country ever fired a scientist as a result of a security breach or the improper transfer of viruses? You're a public servant. People deserve an answer.
I'm not able to answer the question as it was structured.
Were there cases of people being fired for policy breaches?
In fact, you're asking a question that gets back at the two individuals of concern.
No, I'm not, sir. I'm asking a general question. Have there been cases of individuals fired as a result of policy breaches at any lab in Canada?
I'm only aware of the labs for which I have been responsible, and I can't answer the question as it's currently structured. Thank you, sir.
If someone had been fired for a policy breach, what would be meant by the term policy breach?
A policy breach? I don't know. It would be an administrative policy, perhaps. It would be a safety policy, perhaps. It would be a security policy, perhaps. There could be different constructions.
This is such an utter disgrace, but I think I have to move on. Does Canada fund or permit so-called gain-of-function experiments?
Point of order, Mr. Fragiskatos. Let's stop the time.
I had raised a point of order earlier, but you spoke to it as about how we conduct ourselves as parliamentarians. The member, our colleague, is free to ask questions as he wishes, but it's a bit unbecoming when the witness here continues to be badgered like this. Let the questions be asked, of course, but there's a decorum between colleagues that needs to be maintained. And I would just advise my colleague of that. We need to be professional here.
Mr. Chair, on the same point of order,
Mr. Jenness, on the same point of order.
Yeah, I would submit that this is not a point of order. I would submit that pointing out something as a disgrace is perfectly legitimate, and that if Mr. Fragascatos wishes to interrupt the line of questioning in order to offer some cover to a senior public official refusing to answer important public security questions, that's on him, and I'm happy for the public to observe his approach to this hearing and mine and judge accordingly.
Point of order, Mr. Chair, very quickly, if I could.
That's not a matter of order, Mr. Fragascatos. Can I proceed with my questions, Mr. Chair?
I think we've lost the chair.
Okay, in that case, I'll assume the chair is vice chair and continue with my round of questions.
Well, in that case, I raise the point
You're out
of
of order, Mr. Fragascatos. Does Canada fund or permit so-called gain-of-function experiments whereby researchers intentionally make viruses more deadly or more contagious for research purposes?
Point of order, Mr. Jenness.
Yes, Mr. Dubourg, I'll take your point of order.
Yes, Mr. Jenness. Well, listen, we know logic problem, and can we take a break and make sure with the clerk and the technician to get back the chair, please?
Thank you, Mr. Dubourg. No, we're not going to suspend the meeting. We have limited time. I'm going to continue with my line of questions for the remaining 3 minutes that I have, and then I will hand it over to the next person.
Could you please try not to swear this time, though, Mr. Jenness? Could you please try not to swear?
Ms. Zan, order, Ms. Zan, please.
Please stop swearing.
Does Canada fund or permit so-called gain-of-function experiments whereby researchers intentionally make viruses more deadly or more contagious for research purposes?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. The Public Health Agency of Canada, to my knowledge, does not fund research of the nature you're describing, but I'll ask Dr. Poliquin, who runs our lab, to confirm that.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. When experiments are proposed that have the potential for gain-of-function applications, they are automatically referred to the Institutional Biosafety Committee to ensure that no such experiments move forward and that any risks associated with them are mitigated.
Does the government of Canada allow the transfer of viruses? Mr. Fragascatos, yes?
So this is a question for the clerk. Madam Clerk, tell me the procedure here. Because Mr. Jenness has assumed the chair, is he still able to ask questions? He can, again, ask any question he wishes. I'm not trying to get in the way of him asking questions, but I just wonder if it makes sense to briefly pause the meeting for the chair to come back online, who I understand is having tech issues. It's just a bit odd that the vice chair would be also asking questions. I've never seen that happen before, and I think there could be a breach in the protocol of the meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Fragascatos.
To that point of order, Chair?
Yeah, yes, Mr. Harris.
Yes, someone takes the chair in the place of the original chair, then that person has to act as chair, and if he wants to speak, he has to step down from the chair and pass the chair over to somebody else. So I don't think you can be the chair and deal with points of order, particularly ones that are dealing with your right or ability to ask questions at any given time. You would have to cede the chair to somebody else and step aside from the chair while you are asking questions. And it seems that you're trying to perform both functions at once, which I think is out of order.
Okay,
I think is out of order.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. I want to make this as uncontroversial as possible. I'll happily cede the chair to Mr. Bergeron, who I think knows that I have 3 minutes left, but I'll defer to him to allow me to proceed as he wishes.
Monsieur Jenness.
Mr. Jenness, please continue. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron.
Does Canada have a policy of prohibiting the transfer of viruses to other institutions for the purposes of gain-of-function experiments?
Dr. Poliquin, would you like to respond to that, please, sir?
Yes. transfer of materials are governed by the Human Pathogen Toxin Act, as well as the Transport of Dangerous Goods Act and the Canadian Biosafety Standards. And they apply to the export of materials from Canada.
Point of order.
I understand that, but
Mr. Chair, point of order.
Monsieur Fragiskatos.
Mr. Fragiskatos, what is your point of order?
Again, turn it over to Mr. Genis. He said 5 minutes. I believe it's gone well over 5 minutes.
Yeah, because it's been you talking the whole time.
Whoa, no, that is not the case. That is not the case at all.
Oui, bonjour. Pour répondre.
Yes, to answer Mr. Bergeron, if the clock stopped, there were 2 minutes left for Mr. Genis. Please continue then, Mr. Genis.
Very much, Mr. Chair and Madam Clerk. So my question was specific to transfer to institutions that engage in gain-of-function experiments. Does the Wuhan Institute of Virology engage in gain-of-function experiments related to coronaviruses?
Mr. Chair, I apologize. I am not able to answer that particular question.
Okay. If viruses were to be transferred to the Wuhan Institute for Virology, would you, as the head of the lab, be responsible for approving those transfers?
And must be approved by senior management and the National Microbiology Laboratory.
So you are responsible for approving them.
Mr. Genis, colleagues, I'm happy to say that I'm back. I'm sorry for my absence, but I did have my computer shut down on me. I'd like to ask the clerk how long Mr. Genis has had. If he's had 5 minutes, he has another minute left. So, Madam Clerk, can you tell me?
I can confirm he has about a minute left.
Thank you very much. Mr. Genis, please carry on.
Thank you. Mr. Péloquin, you're responsible for approving transfers, but you're unaware as to whether the Wuhan Institute for Virology engages in gain-of-function experiments related to coronaviruses. How would you make determinations about the appropriateness of transfers to that institution if you're unaware about such an important aspect of how transferred materials might be used?
Mr. Chair, every transfer of material is assessed on a case-by-case basis. We have never transferred coronaviruses to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Therefore, we have not assessed the question as structured.
Have you assessed whether they conduct gain-of-function experiments related to the viruses that were transferred?
Mr. Chair, prior to the transfer, one of the essential aspects of the transfer process is receiving a letter from the receiving institute with respect to their intents.
Are you satisfied with their security protocols at the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
Mr. Genis, we'll have to wait for that answer. Your time has concluded. We're now on to Mr. Fragiskatos for 5 minutes. Mr. Fragiskatos, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and you may be aware of this already, but you missed some theatrics when you were gone. Just to let colleagues know, in particular, Mr. Genis, when I raised points of order, they were not to prevent certain questions from being asked. Members have that privilege. They're members of Parliament. My points of order related to, as I said, decorum, parliamentary decorum, allowing a witness to finish an answer, not badgering that witness. It's good to ask hard questions. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's not even a fine line. There's a difference between asking a question in a meaningful way and making a mockery of a parliamentary committee, which I'm afraid my friend Mr. Genis has done yet again. But I'll leave that aside, Mr. Chair. My question is to Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, look, MPs here have asked questions about difficult questions about an ongoing investigation, and they have accused you of being evasive. Is it fair to say that you can't answer the question because there's an ongoing investigation?
There's three aspects. There's privacy with respect to individuals. There's security with respect to the nature of the investigation. And thirdly, I can't speak on behalf of the RCMP and their investigations. So those are the reasons why I've been unable to answer the questions as posed, sir. I'm sorry it's causing stress and unhappiness. It's just that's the legal advice I was provided in preparation for this session.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you a question about the Global Public Health Information or Intelligence Network, rather. Widely respected tool. In fact, as we know, used in a very significant way by the World Health Organization when it comes to the monitoring of pandemic data and threats to international public health more generally beyond pandemics. You know this much better than I do, but I'm just saying this for context. There was an audit that was recently carried out, and this has come up here tonight. But I do want to ask you specifically about that and get your response. And I'm quoting here from a Canadian press report that itself quotes the audit. So I'll put it on record. It says the interim report concluded that the monitoring system did identify the outbreak of pneumonia that would become COVID-19 on the night of December 30th, 2019. This is the point that you referenced earlier, Mr. Stewart. It continues, and included this information from Wuhan, China, in a special report to Canadian public health officials the next day. But the report notes that without sending up a formal alert, international partners that rely on Canada's information were left to rely on other sources. And I'll quote here, as the piece does, directly from the audit. The system identified early open source signals of what would become COVID-19 and promptly alerted senior management does not mean that the system is operating as smoothly or as clearly as it could and should, the report concluded. I just want to put that question to you to get your response as the president of the Public Health Agency of Canada. I think it's a relevant question because this is something that Canadians are asking right now, and I think it does deserve an answer.
Thank you. Through the chair, I would like to agree with you. It is a valued asset. GFIN is important and it needs to play an important role. And the Public Health Agency made changes which I think diminished the value of the asset and its ability to help the health community prepare. In my opening remarks, what I was trying to underline and note was it actually did do its job and it did result in internal action. But your question is underlining that it did not do the external international role it used to play through not transmitting an alert. We see value in those alerts and we have corrected and restored that function. Going forward, the report you're referring to, which is an arm's length review that Minister Hajdu requested, there will be consideration of how we can do a better job in identifying developments of concern and responding more quickly. And I look forward to that advice, to be frank.
Thank you very much. I do have a few seconds, Mr. Chair. If at some point, if you can't conclude the answer here because of limited time, Mr. Stewart, actions taken by PHAC to combat misinformation relating to the pandemic, the conspiracy theories that continue to circulate. Would love to hear more about what PHAC is doing on that front.
Okay,
I'm afraid we'll have. Thank you. Et maintenant, on procède avec Monsieur.
Now we'll move on to Mr. Bergeron, 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Mr. Chair, Mr. Stewart said, revealed a few minutes ago, that is unfortunately too frequent in the government machinery to recommend to officials to say as little as possible to parliamentarians. I don't have the reference under my eyes, but you were Speaker of the House, so you're probably very familiar with this. There was a very important ruling by Speaker Milliken that said that the state machinery, the government machinery, had an obligation to deliver answers to parliamentarians. This being said, there are concerns, security concerns, confidentiality concerns that may well make a witness to be circumspect. Yes, but I would invite the Public Health Agency of Canada to, on a confidential basis, give to parliamentarians the answers that they have asked already in the meeting. There is this obligation to answer, particularly when officials appear, and when they are questioned by parliamentarians to achieve transparency and accountability. I understand you can't say everything publicly, but Mr. Stewart, you could send us in writing after the fact an answer to our questions covered by confidentiality. Without that, Mr. Chairman, I think that we have action that we will be forced to take because we cannot tolerate such an attitude from senior officials with respect to parliamentarians. Parliamentarians are there to obtain answers from the officials. So, to Mr. Fragaskatis, I will give him back the time that I have to use. I understand that you can't say everything publicly. You can't answer the questions publicly, but they have to answer the questions in one way or another. And Mr. Stewart, I say you have this possibility of answering our questions confidentially to the committee. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. I can say, with respect to the point of order, that normally the committee accepts when a witness states that he cannot, for legal reasons, answer a question. The committee accepts that, but at the same time, the committee, as I indicated, the committee can decide to bring this question before the House. So now...
2.5 minutes, Mr. Harris, please.
Thank you, Chair. I think you're referring to me, but I can't hear you. But that's not unusual, so it seems. I would like to ask Mr. Stewart a couple of more questions about the operation of the Global Public Health Information Network. That during the period from January and February, there were continuous information that they gathered that didn't seem to make it to the high levels and in your department. And even up until the end of February, the Chief Public Health Officer told the House of Commons Health Committee that the situation was under control. We have control of the virus. There was just a dozen cases in Canada. But that really wasn't the case, was it, Mr. Stewart? It wasn't under control. In fact, 2 weeks later, there was a public health emergency declared, and we were all under a lockdown. So why was the information that was being garnered by this particular public health agency, GPIN, why was that ignored, and why was that not taken into consideration in making international alerts for one, but also for Canada taking stronger action more quickly?
Thank you for the question, sir. GPHIN is a notification system. It tells you when an event is occurring. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks and in response to the other questions, the notice was provided and it was responded to, and Dr. Tam herself actually answered to that request.
Let me excuse me for 1 second to interrupt you, but they were also giving other information based on what was observed in China and what was happening there, and these notifications were based on information that was gathered, which they had done for years, more than a decade, but they hadn't issued any alerts for the previous 12 months because they weren't allowed to, and that information could have provided and did provide, if you'd listened to it, the ability to detect what was going on. But you didn't do that, and it wasn't passed on to the Canadian public or to the world.
Mr. Chair, as I mentioned earlier, there are actually different streams of information that come out of GPHIN. Some which is internal to the organization, like the daily reports, continued and continue to this day, and some like alerts, as the members have been noting, stop being sent internationally to international partners, for instance.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Harris. We now go on to Mr. Williamson for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a number of questions, but I'm going to return to Mr. Stewart, and my question is, why were the two employees of the National Microbiology Lab terminated? And then, Mr. Chair, I'd like to move that the question be put to Mr. Stewart so we may receive a proper answer.
Mr. Chair, in response to this question from one of the members, I was led to believe that it's possible for me to seek to provide confidential and secure advice to you under certain conditions. That was what one of the members just said previously. If that's a venue that's open to me, you have to understand I don't normally work in security areas. I'm not familiar with this committee or its practices, and there might be ways of responding to the question that you have that I'm not aware of. And so what I would like to do is have the opportunity to explore what is the appropriate legal way to respond to this request. Clearly, I'm not able to orally answer the question in this public telecast venue at this time.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chong, you have a point of order?
Yeah, point of order. According to House of Commons practice and procedure, when a question is put to a witness, the witness is obligated to reply. Testimony in front of this committee is privileged. The witness is not subject. That testimony cannot be used against the witness outside of this committee. In a court of law, it cannot be used in police investigations. It cannot be used against the witness by the Government of Canada or by anyone else. It's privileged testimony. Mr. Williamson asked that the question be put, and the witness has an obligation to answer the question. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chong. If you're asking me to examine the argument you've raised, I would need time to do that and to consider the authorities, as you can imagine.
Well, Mr. Chair, the question was asked to be put to the witness, and so the witness, if the witness has an obligation to answer the question, so you're the chair, so I'd ask you to rule on that, please.
Mr. Chong, it seems to me, from what you read from the procedure book of the House of Commons, it suggests that the witness must answer. It does not talk about how he should answer, and the witness has provided answers, as I indicated earlier, and as I think the clerk will affirm to you, committees generally accept as a reason for not answering legal reasons, and the witness has given fact that he has gotten legal advice and that there are legal reasons, an investigation is going on and so forth for not answering his questions. As I indicated, the committee has, of course, the power, if it should decide to report the matter or some other matter to the House of Commons. So, Mr. Williamson.
Thank you, Chair. Just going to start my timer here. So, Mr. Stewart, am I then to take it that you are committing to providing that information to this committee on a confidential basis, and a response will be forthcoming to the chair?
Mr. Chair, I will commit to explore with legal counsel and the appropriate people who understand the orders of procedure that you're following. What is the venue able to respond to your question? That's what I commit to, sir, to see what I'm able to do.
All right, because you gave us three rationales for not answering. There's a fourth one, and that is just bureaucratic butt covering, incompetence, malfeasance in the department. So the reasons you gave us are far from exhaustive, and in fact, you're treating this committee as if we are members of the press looking for answers, and we don't have rights to these answers. So we look forward to your response. I'm not going to dwell on it because our time here is limited, but I do hope that information is forthcoming. So I think you'll see there's a consensus, and at least among the opposition parties here, that answers are needed. Turning now to the Dr. Guillain, might have mispronounced that, and if Guillaume, excuse me. Your last answer to my colleague on assessing the letter from a Chinese entity, you didn't provide an answer because we ran out of time. Could you do you take these letters from China as the truth and nothing but the truth, or what investigations do you go to ensure that the letter will be honored?
Mr. Chair, To complete the answer, when we received the letter from the director of the Wuhan Institute of Virology with respect to the intended use of the viruses, they were to be used for understanding pathophysiology, so the nature of the infection as well as the development of antivirals. Canada does not have this, and the National Microbiology Lab rather does not have the standing to investigate or audit laboratories, but the request for an assessment is what is required under the HPTA and the TDG Act.
First of all, excuse me, I see it's Dr. Pollock, and I apologize for mangling that previously, but that's an astonishing admission. So you're taking a request from a nation that has a history of theft, lies, and accepting that because that's what the law in this country says, that is sufficient at a time when our national security institutes are warning academia in general to be very careful. That's a remarkable testimony. Is that in fact what you're telling us here, that letter goes into a file and the box is ticked and data then is transferred based on the word of a government that is known to lie not only to its people but to the world community?
Mr. Chair, should I answer?
Well, I can. Go ahead, please. I'll give you a few seconds.
Mr. Chair, there is a extensive approach that is undertaken prior to the transfer of materials. The Wuhan Institute of Virology is a organization dedicated to public health.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Williamson. Remarkable. Now to Ms. Yip for 5 minutes, for the last 5 minutes of this hour.
Sorry about that. I had some trouble with the mute. Dr. Poliquin, scientists and governments around the world have been working together to combat COVID-19, and Canada has been an active partner in the global fight. Can you tell us more about Canada's collaboration with the international community and any work that FIHAC and NLL are doing with international partners?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The global community has collaborated extensively around the response to COVID-19, including through the convening power of the World Health Organization. The sharing of sequence data from China on the weekend of January 10th was what made us and the NML able to develop our first generation test for COVID-19 in 5 days. Following the publication of that sequence. And therefore, I think this illustrates the essential nature of international collaboration as we continue to fight this pandemic. The National Microbiology continues to be engaged both domestically and internationally in a number of efforts, including through the Global Health Security Lab Network, which has represented an essential forum for the sharing of information, science and learnings with respect to SARS-CoV-2, and continues to be a source of ongoing support.
With this international collaboration, does this also extend to having, PIHAC's policy on participation with the Foreign Talent Recruitment Program?
Apologies, Mr. Chair.
So I'm just, okay, so let me just restate this if it makes it clearer. What is PIHAC's policy on participation in foreign talent recruitment programs?
It's Ian Stewart here, if I may, Mr. Chair. Participation in foreign talent programs, are you referring to a specific program, for instance, like the 1,000 Talents program, or do you mean just talent development programs generically? Please excuse me for the clarification.
the ones such as the ones offered by China?
Such as things like the Thousand Towns program?
That's right.
Programs of that nature, we would tend to see as a conflict of interest. If you're an employee of the Government of Canada, we would expect that you would not also be involved in another government's programs in that way. Okay, well, that would be my answer, I guess.
So are there any Chinese nationals visiting or working at the NLML right now?
So, Mr. Chair, with respect to how visiting officials are handled with respect to working at the National Microbiology Laboratory, following the development of the working officials policy, which is in the final status of its current review, a working official agreement is required prior to working at the NML. And that includes an agreement that covers things such as IP rights, access to facilities, but also requires a valid security clearance of a secret level to be obtained prior to work commencing at the National Microbiology Laboratory.
So currently, is there a security policy, or is that what you just stated in the works?
No, Mr. Chair, there is an existing security policy. The National Microbiology required a secret clearance, as well as a number of other supportive documents prior to commencing work at the NML. But we are an organization of continual improvement, and the latest iteration of the working official policy is under.
Can you just, okay, I only have a little bit of time left. What is the major improvement in the new working policy?
Mr. Chair, it's not necessarily a significant change. It is just an ongoing review of these policies and of development of streamlined processes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Yip. This concludes the first panel. And I will now excuse and thank the witnesses, and we'll take a short pause, a very short pause, I think, as we go to the next panel. So we'll take a 2-minute. Is that enough?
Sorry, point of order, Mr. Chair. Just
that, Mr. Jenis?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Just before the witness is excused, I want you to clarify just your intention with respect to following up with the witness on the follow-up information that was requested. Mr. Williams had put forward a motion that the question be responded to. Mr. Stewart noted that he would seek advice on how to respond. This is a simple piece of information that I think the committee could receive on a fairly time-sensitive basis. So I just trying to understand from a perspective of procedure what your intention is, Mr. Chair, on following up and distributing this information.
So it's certainly my intention to await. I will anticipate a response from Mr. Stewart. I presume a written response, which I would then, of course, share with the committee in terms of how he proposes to deal with what's been raised this evening. The committee, of course, may wish or could choose, for example, to pass a motion giving a time limit and indicating that it wants expecting a response, and then proceed from there in whatever way it wishes. If you wish, we could ask Mr. Stewart if he has a timeline in mind. What is the preference of the committee?
Mr. Chair, I believe if you seek it, you'll find unanimous consent from the committee to ask Mr. Stewart to provide a response by the end of the week.
Thank you very much. Let me ask if there is any members who are opposed to that motion. Seeing none.
Mr. Chair, if I could you just have, sorry, there was an audio issue on my end. Could you just have Mr. Jenis just repeat what his motion is?
Mr. Jenis, would you please repeat?
Mr. Chair, what I said is that I believe you'd find unanimous consent that Mr. Stewart be asked to provide a response to the committee with respect to the questions that weren't answered by the end of the week.
My only issue, if I could, Mr. Chair.
Skadis.
Thank you. My My only issue with that is there's an ongoing investigation that I don't know. I don't know if it will conclude by the end of the week. So I agree that a follow-up ought to happen. I believe information further to what's been brought forward today could be provided to the committee. That's not in question, but putting a timeline on it by the end of this week seems a bit strange.
Mr. Chair, if I could just clarify, and hopefully this will address the concerns of Mr. Fragascatos, that we would be clear as a committee respecting a response to these issues by the end of the week. Mr. Stewart can provide a response before the end of the week, and then we can determine, following receiving that response, whether we want to take further steps. But it's up to him to respond, and he can do so in private in the way he thinks fit by the end of the week. But we are clearly seeking additional information.
Thank you very much. So I will then ask again whether Mr. Genis has asked for unanimous consent for this motion. Does any member object to this motion? Seeing none, the motion is adopted. Madam Clerk?
Maybe just to clarify, by the end of the week, we're saying Friday at 5, or?
Is anyone object to Friday at 5? That's the timing then. I don't see any objection.
How about noon, so we can give the clerk a little chance to send it around before we all knock off for the recess?
Maybe Friday at like 2 is fair. Is that
well?
or noon. I'm just
as long as we can agree on something, that would be helpful. I'm just looking for agreement on something. So
sure. Sure.
So is there any objection to Friday at 2? Does everyone agree to Friday at 2?
Sure.
That's agreed? Okay, that's what we're asking. That's what we're looking for. Thank you. That's agreed then. That motion is adopted. Thank you very much to the witnesses, and you're now excused. And we'll set up for the next panel. Madam Clerk, combien de minutes avez-vous besoin pour...
How many minutes do you need?
Yeah, witnesses now.
Okay, 2 minutes. Thank you. An individual, Christopher Parsons, Senior Research Associate for the Citizen Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, University of Toronto. We also have Mr. Janis Sarts, Director of the NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence, who is joining us from Riga, Latvia, where I think it's very, very late. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you both for being here. In fact, I think it's 1:30 in the morning, in fact, for Mr. Sarts. Perhaps we can start with you for your opening remarks. Please proceed. You have 5 minutes, and then we'll go to Mr. Parsons. Mr. Sarts, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the invitation. I'll probably first a little bit describe the institution I represent, which is NATO Center of Excellence for Strategic Communication, which is a NATO-affiliated organization that researches and looks into the issues of influence operations and how hostile actors are using this for undermining the democracies, how it works in the information space, and increasingly what we call into the cognitive conflict. And the views I will present today are views of my own, based on the research by the center, and are not agreed positions of NATO itself. So with that caveat, I would probably shortly kind of sketch out how we see China in the influence operations. And of course, as NATO institution, we've been for many years looking at Russian activity, but over the last few years, we've increasingly have looked at the Chinese activity. So quickly to look at how we see that that activity, we see that from, let's say, the way they process their influence operation through more soft touch, soft power angle, trying to create a favorable image of China, has transformed it much more increasingly adopting hard-handed and assertive measures against the countries, not only within their own neighborhood, which was the case some time ago already, but increasingly adapting these measures also to the countries that are further away, especially when there are key elements of contention where they believe the Chinese interests are at stake. And of course, here one has to point out the different value systems that democratic countries and China has. If I look at the areas of influence that they are good at, in our view, they are very good at using the leverages they have, especially in the economic front and infrastructure front. They are very active in the technology landscape, first and foremost in cyber activities, hacking and espionage, but also at more nuanced technology activities like data and emerging technologies. And then, of course, they are quite good in most of the cases, but not always, at targeting the Chinese communities for their influence. Well, they are not yet very good at, but I think they're quickly gaining ground, is what we call the information warfare. We've noted in most of the cases they've used what I would call an old school methodology of communist propaganda system that has not worked very well, but they have been quickly adopting, and in particular some of the Russian tactics have been adopted in the information front as we speak. In a kind of next steps, we see that they increasingly will try to leverage their technological powers and try to gain more say in the infrastructure of the future of the technologies. In that say, I believe that they see data and AI as very critical future technologies where they would want to have a strong leverages, not only within China, but also outside. We was very great, not interest, but we look at the social scoring systems that they're developed, which we believe are not the way the technology has to be used, but we see with a concern the export of this technology and the possible impact of the social scoring system also on the Western companies wanting to operate in the Chinese territory, which will have, I think, significant impact. All in all, as Chinese modus operandi change to more hard-handed approach, we foresee there will be more contention, more pressure, especially given that the core elements of the Chinese system and the way they view the world are fundamentally different from that of democratic countries, and therefore there is inbuilt conflict on the value system side, and therefore we see that there will be increase not only in the competition but also in the influence operations from China, and they'll increasingly trying to leverage especially technology but also economic and infrastructural positions they have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sartz. Mr. Parsons, you have 5 minutes. Please proceed.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Christopher Parsons. As mentioned, I'm a senior research associate at the Citizen Lab. I appear before this committee in a professional capacity that represents my views and those of the Citizen Lab, and comments are based on our research into Chinese technology companies. The Citizen Lab is an academic institution, and our work operates at the intersection of technology and human rights. In my time, I want to point to some of the ways by which we can develop trust in the products and services that are manufactured in, transited through, or operated from China. I do so by first turning to the issue of supply chain dependencies. A rising concern is the extent to which Canadian companies, such as Telecoms, might become dependent on products made by Chinese companies, inclusive of Huawei. Dependency runs the risk of generating monocultures, or cases in which a single company dominates a Canadian organization's infrastructure. In such cases, up to 3 risks can arise. First, monocultures can enable foreign governments to leverage dependencies on a vendor to apply pressure in diplomatic, trade, or defense negotiations. Second, monocultures can create a path dependency, and especially in 5G telecommunications environments, where there's often a degree of vendor lock-in into telecom vendors' equipment. Third, monocultures risk hindering competition amongst telecommunications vendors to the effect of increasing capital costs to Canadian telecommunications providers. All these challenges can, in part, be mediated by requiring diversity in Canadian telecommunications companies' networks, as has been recommended in the past by the CSC's Deputy Chief of Information Technology Security, Scott Jones. In this case, trust would come from not placing absolute trust in any given infrastructure vendor. I now turn to building trust in software and hardware systems more generally. Software and hardware errors are often incidentally placed into digital systems. Some errors are egregious, such as including old and known vulnerable code in a piece of software. And others are more akin to spelling or grammar errors, such as failing to properly delimit a block of code. There are also limited situations where state agencies compel private companies to inject vulnerabilities into their products or services to enable espionage or attack operations. No single policy can alleviate all of the risks posed by vulnerabilities. However, some can enhance trust by reducing the prevalence of incidental vulnerabilities and raising the cost of deliberately injecting vulnerabilities into digital systems. Some of these trust-enhancing policies include, first, requiring companies to provide a bill of goods that declares their products as software libraries and dependencies, as well as their versions. This would help to ensure that known deficient code isn't placed in critical infrastructure, and also help responders identify vulnerable systems upon any later discovery of vulnerabilities in the libraries or dependencies. Second, Canada and its allies can improve on existing critical infrastructure assessments by building assessment centers that complement the UK's, which presently assesses Huawei equipment. Working collectively with our allies, we'd be better able to find incidental vulnerabilities while raising the likelihood of discovering state adversaries' attempts to deliberately slip vulnerabilities into systems as code bases. Third, Canada could adopt robust policies and processes to ensure that government agencies disclose vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure to appropriate vendors and communities, as opposed to potentially secretly hoarding them for signals intelligence or cyber operations. I now briefly turn to increasing trust in Chinese social media platforms. Citizen Lab research has shown that WeChat has previously placed Canadians' communications under political surveillance to subsequently develop censor lists that are applied to China-registered WeChat accounts. Our research into TikTok, released today, revealed there is no apparent or overt political censorship or untoward surveillance of Canadians' communications on that platform. Based on our findings, we suggest that social media companies be required to publish more information on their activities to enhance trust. This would include publishing detailed content moderation guides, publishing how and why companies engage in monitoring and censorious behavior, publishing how organizations interact with government agencies and address their corresponding demands, and publishing annual transparency reports that detail the regularity and effects of state and non-state actors who make requests for users' data. Platforms could also be compelled to make available algorithms for government audit where there is reason to suspect they are being used to block or suppress lawful communications in Canada, or where they are being used to facilitate influence operations. Platforms could also be compelled to disclose when user data flows through or is accessible by parts of their organizations which have problematic human rights, data protection, or rule of law histories. To conclude, we at the Citizen Lab believe that the aforementioned sets of recommendations would ameliorate some of the cyber-related risks linked with the Chinese supply chain management issue and social media platform issues more broadly. However, we also believe that these policies should be applied in a vendor and country agnostic way to broadly improve trust in digital systems. I would just note to the committee that the brief that we have also submitted provides additional details and recommendations, and especially as applied to internet standards, which I have declined to get into in this. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Chair, you are on mute.
Excusez-moi. Thank you very much. Monsieur Paulus, on commence le premier tour.
We will begin the first turn of questioning. Mr. Paulus, 6 minutes. Thank you, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us. My first question is to Mr. Sartz. You know, as the Vice Chair of the Parliamentary Security Defense Committee for 3 years, this has been of interest to me, that is to say, cyber security. But one of the difficulties we had was the posture of the alliance with respect to the cyber security threat. Do you think that the alliance is better able now to withstand cyber attacks, say, from China now?
Mr. Sartz?
Yes. Well, alliance is the collective nations, and as you know, for nations to agree, it takes time, and also to develop the capabilities, it takes time. I think in last decade, basically, alliance has zoomed much more on the cyber defense, and instead of just being a national business, it has been moved to the collective business, and the cyber realm has been named a new domain for the NATO as an alliance, and certainly the collective capabilities have increased. But of course, as we know, Sorry.
Oh, thank you, sir. Must continue. Thank you very much. Prochaine question, Monsieur.
Mr. Parsons, my question is for you. Hello, I'm happy to see you. You mentioned in your report that Canada has a G5 strategy problem. That is to say, there is a lack of industrial integrated policies founded on principles that directly would be able to be found in the G5 landscape. Can you just expand on this? Do you think Canada would be vulnerable in terms of China?
Thank you for your question. In the work that the Citizen Lab has done, one of the points that we have made is there's a concern that we have in that there's a great deal of attention focused on Huawei and the vulnerabilities in Huawei equipment. And while that is appropriate to be concerned of that vendor, there's an equal need to look at how other companies who may serve the 5G infrastructure would operate. And so we believe that both Ericsson and Nokia, as well as Samsung and other parties, should similarly go through strong assessments to ensure that all equipment that goes into Canada's infrastructure is strong. It's not sufficient to remove Huawei and then let in other vendors who may have security deficiencies.
Effectivement que...
Yes. All those businesses that are involved in telecommunications should, in fact, be assessed. Yes. But we have learned that recently that the Chinese government has been at the source of the attack on Microsoft Exchange. Do you think that the government of Canada has what it needs to be able to face this type of attack? Are our services adequately protected?
I believe in the context of critical infrastructure development, such as telecoms, Canada can't go it alone. And indeed, for most services, Canada can't go it alone. And as a result, one of the things that the Citizen Lab has recommended is that Canada, along with like-minded friendly nations, figure out ways of doing information assurance collectively. So that may mean that in the hardware space, some look at one country looks at Samsung, another at Huawei, another at Ericsson. And when it comes to services such as Microsoft's challenges, again, we're a coordinated analysis by the NSA, by the CSE, by the GCHQ, and other intelligence alliances is important to assess and identify these vulnerabilities.
But as you mentioned in your first paragraph, you said that Canada has a problem with respect to clear policy on, say, G5 and infrastructure. We are not administering the problem. So if there were a direct attack, do you think that we should be concerned about our defenses? Do we have what we need to defend ourselves?
The concern that I and my colleagues have written about in the past is there does seem to be an ongoing incoherence to the way that Canada has developed its cybersecurity strategy. And I would note that while there is a federal policy, it is somewhat out of date, and the instrumentalization of that policy has not seen the light of day. So if it exists, it's not public to date.
Very quickly, I only have a minute left. The American government has a blacklist of businesses, Chinese businesses, that pose a risk to American national security. They are businesses and they carry out Chinese army operations. Do you have something similar? According to the information that you have, are there operators here in Canada that are operating from within Canada in terms of cyber attacks?
I believe that was directed to me. Thank you for your question. Unfortunately, the Citizen Lab does not have that kind of threat intelligence.
Merci. Mon temps est fini.
Thank you. My time's run out. Thank you. Mr. Paulus.
Go to Ms. Zan for 6 minutes. Ms. Zan, please. Do we have Ms. Zan, or has she been disconnected for some reason? If I don't have Ms. Zan, I think I'll have to go on to Ms. Yip. Ms. Yip, please.
Thank you for coming before us in the committee. My question is directed to Mr. Parsons. You mentioned that you, in your brief, that you don't feel that it should only be one vendor, that there should be many vendors because it makes us vulnerable across our entire spectrum. How can we build a strong 5G network? And my next question is, how can we, with so many vendors potentially participating, how can we make it a coherent network if things tend to be sticky between the networks?
Thank you very much for your question. I believe that, and this is paralleled by the CSE, that what's required is to ensure that our networks have multiple vendors operating in them. And so that may mean that there's a combination of Samsung, Ericsson, Nokia, and other vendors as is appropriate. In order to actually assess them, again, I think that we work collaboratively with our international partners to ensure that the technologies that are going in are fit for duty. And moreover, when we're talking billion-dollar purchases, we can impose some sort of expectations on interoperability. Further, with regards to stickiness, there's a process taking place right now called Open RAN, which would, in a way, democratize some of the way telecommunications equipment was set up. It would basically let you take equipment off the shelf as opposed to highly specialized equipment and use that to develop parts of the 5G radio network. And I believe that the Canadian government pushing towards that would be one way of improving on the network and reducing some of the stickiness, at least.
Ms. Zhang, could you please use your headset if you have it there? Oh, you have it. Okay, thank you. Please go ahead.
Okay. Oh, okay. How concerned should Canada be about China's development or involvement in developing the Open RAN standards?
Because it is an open standard, I think that it's something to be mindful that China is involved in, but it makes sense economically from their carriers as well. I think it's an area where Canada has to actively engage. And one of the ways of doing it, in addition to, of course, the government of Canada directly participating, is finding ways of encouraging our corporations and businesses in academic units to also participate, which could involve some sort of funds set up by the government of Canada to enable academics to participate or nonprofits, and possibly find other ways based on tax incentives to encourage our companies to also get involved in those discussions.
Would they be willing to do this if there were intellectual property concerns?
One of the aims and aspirations of the Open RAN Alliance is to ensure that the technology is in fact open. So a series of standards that aren't inherently captured by one organization or one company or another. And so they are self-interested in getting involved in that, because right now, if you purchase equipment from any of the large carriers, or the large vendors rather, it's quite expensive. And Open RAN currently promises to reduce those costs. So there is an incentive, even if they don't own the IP, to be involved in developing the standard itself.
In regards to your recommendations on Chinese social media, are there any Western social media platforms that operate at this level of transparency? And if so, what actions were taken by the governments to have them give up this information?
There are not currently any in North America that adhere to all of the recommendations that we have. We are certainly trying to advocate for increasing trust writ large, so not just in Chinese social media, but also companies that we're very familiar with, like Facebook, Twitter, and the rest. There are some elements that we're seeing movement in North America. So we do, as an example, have more robust transparency reports that are available in other jurisdictions. Facebook and others do disclose their lawful access handbooks. They're quite useful and quite accessible. But we don't have things like algorithmic transparency or accountability, nor do we necessarily have the degree of awareness as to how companies interpret the law, which is almost more important than anything else, because how a company interprets the law versus how the law is written can often be not one-to-one.
Okay. You mentioned in your brief that the most significant breach of cybersecurity in recent history happened when SolarWinds was hacked over the course of 9 months last year. To your knowledge, what has the impact been for Canadian organizations using SolarWinds products?
To the best of my knowledge, and based on open source information, is there has been a relatively minimal breach of Canadian organizations to date, although we are learning almost on a daily or weekly basis that the number of victims are going up. So the current impact seems to be relatively minimal, but I suspect that the actual assessment of that will take a considerably longer period of time.
Okay. During your last appearance before a House of Commons committee in February 2019, you addressed the issue of encryption and how Canada needs to adopt a national encryption policy. Could you tell us how this would protect us from foreign interference?
Yes. So encryption is one of the few things that can be relied upon to keep data safe. And so one of the things that the Citizen Lab has argued for repeatedly is the availability of what's called end-to-end encryption. So encryption that goes for a message is secured from your device, goes to someone else's device, and only the two parties can access it. That's especially important as we see more and more systems move to the internet, because it ensures that when and if the network is compromised, whoever has compromised the network can't gain access to the communications that have transited across it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Yip. Et maintenant, on procédera avec...
Now we'll move on with Mr. Bergeron, 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Thank you for being here, and thank you for shedding light on the work that we are doing and our observations. I'm grateful to Mr. Parsons, but particularly to Mr. Sartz, because it's so late for him there. and he's giving us the time this evening. I'll start with Mr. Sartz. During an appearance before the Special Commission in the democratic process in the European Union on February the 22nd last, you spoke to certain information and how things work. When you look at the conclusions concerning the European parliamentary election in 2019 and the election in the States as well that has just occurred, it seems to me there is some cause for concern. Perhaps you could help me out here. It seems that there was the same type of foreign interference in those elections. Greg Austin, who directs the cyberspace program at the International Strategic Institute, says that Chinese abilities would be much less than Canada's in terms of defense, Canada being 9, China being ranked 27th. So given how this works in private companies, how can you explain that Western powers seem to agree to put them in this vulnerable space without reacting?
Merci pour votre.
Thank you very much for your question. We've been looking that most of these social media companies that we use for everyday life have become the agora for democratic process, and most of the elections actually play out in these platforms. So what we've detected is that basically all of those platforms are manipulable by robotic networks to put the messages, to game the algorithms, also including during the election processes, to advance particular interests, including of hostile actors. And we've been measuring every year how well the platforms do in taking out these robotic networks from platforms. And the results have been very, very disappointing. Because back in 2019, when there was the European Parliament elections, we bought 55,000 different actions through robotic accounts on the social media, of course, neutral effects, for €300. During the EU parliamentary elections, 90% of that got delivered. We repeated the same experiment during US presidential elections, also once again in a neutral manner, but we were able to buy likes, shares, views, custom-made comments, all of that, 300,000 this time for $300. And about 70% of that got through. So basically, there was an option for outside actors to influence the discourse. And most of the companies were incapable to eradicate that process. If I have to measure the companies, typically Twitter is the best at it. Facebook is less so. And this last year, we first time measured TikTok. TikTok is basically defenseless. You can do any gaming of that system as you wish. And of course, the more potential electors are there, the more malign things can be happening. And clearly, that goes back to Mr. Person's point. There is no way to oversee what the social media companies are doing. They're declaring great success. But when we turn to the vendors of these manipulations, it's cheap, available, and effective. And we have to have an oversight to make sure that it is not neither simple nor easy. Thank you. Je vous remercie. I thank you for your answer. It was a very complete one. But I come back to the question that I asked you, more specifically, Mr. Sartz, given the fact that China, for example, and I could say, we probably could say the same thing about Russia, but taking into account the fact that China's cyber defense capabilities are really inferior to those of most Western countries. Why do we major powers here agree to live in an environment of being accessible to interference by, say, China? Why isn't there the possibility to establish a system of deterrence? Maybe even one that would include reprisals. Something that could discourage powers like China or Russia from undertaking their interference.
You have a very, very 10-second answer, Mr. Sartz.
Thank you. I think U.S. just did it in 2020 by discouraging Russia, as we've seen from open source report. So it is possible to do if you have leverage and you have resources and the political will.
Thank you very much. And now Mr. Harris for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both for your interesting presentations. Mr. Sartz, you just described the ability in the EU elections or that you could buy data and then send messages to that data. Can you give us an example of where that would come from? Would this be private operators providing this information for sale to make money, or is this part of some other effort that might be being done by a state actor?
Both. There are private actors that do it for sale, and there are what we believe are state actors by continuously following these networks. And in some cases, there are hybrid networks where most of the time they would do kind of business-related things for gaming marketing or influencer posts. And about 10 to 15% of the time would do the political impact. So there is variety of players in the field.
So you can influence election by getting information about who likes what and then sending a targeted message. Is that exactly how it works?
Well, that is one of the ways, and of course you can use these automated robotic networks that seem like humans to en masse create reactions in the online media, gaming the algorithm, making some posts much more visible than others, making, for instance, specific comments at for instance, the political leaders' social media presence, discouraging or making the false appearances. There are many ways how one can use that infrastructure for effect.
And is there any technical or technological defense to any of that, or how do you deal with it? I think I was reading a comment about your when you testified at the United States Select Committee on Intelligence in 2017, suggesting public awareness campaigns could counter and influence operations that target populations. Of course, that was 2017, and we've seen an awful lot happen since then. Are you optimistic? Was that an optimistic statement that a public awareness campaign could be a defense to that, or are there other techniques that it might be possible now?
Well, first, public awareness campaigns are important because if we don't do them, then we are even more vulnerable. But on the particular issue, obviously, the part of the defenses is within the social media companies, and they're, in our assessment, are not doing affect our public discourses that is happening on these platforms, and therefore some kind of regulatory framework on our side would be necessary.
And how would they stop them, Mr. Sartz?
Well, actually, it is very simple because you can create algorithms that see these things for what they are. How do we, for instance, if we buy this robotic accounts effect, you could see that account. We report that account to the Facebook or Twitter. Most of the time, their algorithm doesn't detect it. It's just upgrading their algorithms and being better at their jobs, which is not the case at this point.
So you're saying that these companies could actually police that activity if they were motivated to do so, shall we say?
Yes, if there would be a better business case for them, I believe they could.
Mm-hmm. You also talked about another tool that's used to called data scraping. I guess that's what we're talking about here, using an artificial intelligence algorithm and data scraping to influence behavior. And you referred to some an event actually influencing the behavior of military operatives by obtaining information. Could you explain how that works and what the dangers that can be in that, something like that?
Yes, we've 2 years ago we tried an experiment trying the hypothesis that the data, open source data, can be used to influence human behaviors, and we did an experiment together with the Latvian Armed Forces during a military exercise where we scraped the open source data for the soldiers, and based on that data, then we tried to impact their behavior during the military exercise, and we succeeded to make soldiers disobey orders, make them leave the positions they're supposed to defend, just based on the data that is available, and basically underlining the future risk of big data that is available. And if it's used in a malign way, it can not only bring, as it is currently, the marketing product, it can also shift the beliefs and behaviors. And in the wrong hands, it is a very dangerous tool. And in that respect, I would highlight the future risks of 5G. It's not about only the infrastructure, it's also about the data that is going to flow in that system. And that is incredibly valuable if you look from the hostile actors perspective to get an access to that kind of societal data, because with certain AI capacity, you could actually sway the behaviors of the other societies.
That's fascinating, and I was in Riga one time with the NATO Parliamentary Association. I think I've been at your center, and there was a lot of concern in those days about the disinformation campaigns of the Russians trying to undermine the interest in democracy in the Baltic states. Is that still going on?
Yes, it is, of course, still going on. But as we see from a Russian perspective, they've moved their eyes more to the other bigger players and most of the resources they're spending there. But of course, Baltics is still a target, but not the main target.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Harris. As we only have a few minutes remaining, what I propose to do is try and distribute it equitably with 3 minutes to Mr. Williamson, 3 minutes to Ms. Zan, 1 minute et 30 seconds to Mr. Bergeron, and 1 minute.
1 minute, 30 seconds for Mr. Bergevin, and the same for Mr. Harris.
Oh, thank you. Mr. Parsons, a couple of years ago, I see you authored a report or a co-author, The Predator in Your Pocket. It touched on DNA sourcing and DNA transfers, and you referenced the 23andMe. Have you looked at, we now fast forward a year and a half, BGI, the world's largest biotech firm, was given approval by Health Canada to offer COVID-19 testing in this country. Do you have concerns about the transfer of the health and DNA of Canadians to mainland China for use in that country?
Before you answer, Mr. Williamson, would you please turn on your camera? Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Pardon me.
With the answer.
Thank you for the question. I haven't looked specifically into that case, but certainly what we have seen in our research and analysis of other parties' research is that DNA information is incredibly sensitive. And so there is a concern, of course, when any highly sensitive data is moving to any country outside of Canada, and that would be inclusive of China.
Can you talk then about the information, if you can expand on the 23andMe, why you felt the need to highlight that in the paper and why that was a risk? And the difference here is that that's on an individual basis where that information is being collected and possibly shared, versus the BGI, which is possibly collecting it on hundreds of thousands of Canadians. But could you just address why 23andMe and that transfer is critical to have a handle on it?
Yes, absolutely. So the first concern is how that data will be used to affect the individual themselves. So it is collected under a certain set of terms, and will that set of terms be applied on an ongoing basis? The secondary concern is, while it does reveal information about the individual, it also reveals information about their entire family, including members who may not yet be born. And so the ability to use genetic information to derive information about your current next of kin or your forthcoming next of kin is something that we really can't predict. And genetic technology is just exploding. So the actual uses are pretty broad.
And as I understand it, it is possible with that information for scientists to even proactively discover and then reach out to individuals and say, you could very well develop this disease or this medical treatment, which I think just puts the emphasis on how this data is important. What do you think Canada should do to safeguard the bio data of Canadians?
It's a very good question. I can only speak in the commercial context, as I'm not sufficiently aware of how it's being handled in China. But generally, I think that there should be strong requirements that delimit how information can be used, inclusive of no secondary uses can be used or no modifications of primary uses can be used without the affirmative and meaningful consent of the individual.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Williamson. Ms. Zan, 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. Well, I have to say it's been a very interesting meeting and presentations, and I want to thank both gentlemen for your very interesting information that you've shared with us. I wish I had longer, but Mr. Sartz, I would like to ask you about your book, Disinformation as a Threat to National Security, and disinformation and fake news. So you must have been extremely concerned when you saw what was going on in the United States with regards to, the storming of Washington, of the Capitol, and all of the disinformation that has been propagated on social media and really continues. So can you please explain to us how you think we can best fight against the creation of divisions in society and the widening of existing fractures that undermine trust in government, the military, and the country's security systems?
Well, thank you very much. I would say first, yes, we're undergoing the profound change in the information environment. The very core of what creates and makes the democratic process run, the bloodstream of a democracy. And it changes in a way that is not helpful of society coming together. And to a large extent, it is because the social media companies have found a way how to monetize that environment through promoting the information that is biased, creating echo chambers or information bubbles, and increasingly putting the citizens within those. And it is without outside interference that it happens. And of course, outside actors, hostile actors, just exacerbate that situation. So I'm back to the fundamentals. We have to make sure that the rules and laws that we have in a normal kind of democratic discourse would be applied to the same place. And at least the algorithmic transparency is a must. And of course, then we would see, how to make it more adequate.
Thank you. I've also read that the more explosive that a statement can be on social media, it attracts the eyes of people. So you can tell the biggest lie and the most extravagant make the most extravagant statement, and that's the sort of thing people are attracted to. Could you expand on that a little bit, please?
Well, that's what the neuroscience says, how the human brain works. We're attracted to the emotional and instinctive things and are much harder to go about the rational decision making. And the algorithms of those social media companies are actually using that element for gaining our attention. And
thank you.
The more attention is there, the bigger money they can make. And that's actually, I think, the wrong thing with this.
Sorry to interrupt, but that's your time, Ms. Zan. Et maintenant, on procédera pendant une...
Now, 1 minute, 30 seconds for Mr. Bergeron. Thank you very much, Chair. To Mr. Parsons, Adam Siegel, Director of the Program on Digital Security on the Council on Foreign Relations, that WeChat, TikTok, should not be put on the telephones of American officials. You will recall that CSIS told members that they should be very wary of using a WeChat because of cybersecurity threats. Should Canadians and Quebecers be suspicious of WeChat and TikTok and follow the recommendations of CSIS?
Thank you for your question. I believe that what is important when looking at these platforms and systems is to appreciate that some people have greater or less great risks than others. So elected officials, in one case, they may be concerned about the data that's being collected. However, in our research on TikTok, we found no overt surveillance and no overt censorship. It may happen at some point, but not in our research. And in the case of WeChat, we saw that there has been the usage of Canadians' communications to build up a censor index that is then applied to individuals who operate or live within China. So I think Canadians are right to be concerned, in particular about the way that WeChat has historically, at least, used their communications to build that censor index. Currently, we have no evidence of a clear problem with TikTok.
Combien de temps il me reste, monsieur?
How much time do you have left, Chair?
Est-ce qu'il me reste du temps?
Do I have any time left, Chair?
I'm sorry, Chair, you're still on mute.
I'm very sorry. Je suis désolé que c'était en sordine.
Sorry.
Harris for 1.5 minutes. Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Parsons, I have lots of questions for you, but only not very much time to ask them. But one very important one, you make 6 recommendations of what companies should be required to publish with respect to their social media platforms, including publishing guidelines explaining the way they're subject to state-mandated surveillance, that they make themselves available, their algorithms available for government audits, transparency reports, et cetera, Do we have the means to actually force companies to do those things in order to be able to operate in this country?
I think for some of them, we certainly do. So as one example, I think that we could compel Facebook and other companies to explain how they interact with perhaps Chinese companies as well as Canadian companies. In other cases, I believe that we would have to work with our allies. So the United States, Europe, and other jurisdictions to put pressure on the companies and or pass legislation in the countries where they operate out of.
Is there any activity coordinated to do that work, or is that something that you're recommending that we should start to do, or is it happening already?
I think we're seeing pieces of that in the United States, in the European Union, but it isn't something that I would say is an agreed upon position by respective governments. So I think it's a place where Canada can participate with our closest allies to make movement on this.
So we better start getting cracking if we're going to have any control over this monster.
We would certainly hope that that would be something that the government looks at.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. Mr. Parsons, thank you very much. And thank you for understanding how much we appreciate you, but also Mr. Sartz, for whom it's now 2:30 in the morning. And I'm sure you won't mind us making a particular fuss about the fact that it's so late for him, but we do very much appreciate both of you being with us this evening. Thank you so much on behalf of my colleagues, and have a good evening. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.